Welcome to your first official algebra recording of the week. I will be doing these recordings for you each week. I will go over any important announcements for the week, and I'll also introduce to you the concepts that you're going to be learning for the week, and just a brief summary of what you're going to see for the week. I do want to make sure that you have a math notebook at this time and you've got it out and ready to take notes. You will want to take notes as you're watching the weekly recordings, and these notes are going to help you in a couple of different ways. First of all, if you're more active by taking notes, you're going to get a lot more out of these recordings. You're going to do a lot more learning. Second, you can refer back to your notes when you're going to do the weekly assignments, the graded assignments for the week, and they will be super helpful for you. So the more notes you take while you watch the recording, the more you're going to get out of them. Please remember that you can always click on the pause button. That's what's really cool about recordings. You can always click pause. You can click rewind. That way you can take good notes as you're watching the recording, or if there was something I said that you missed, you can go back and rewatch it by rewinding. So this week we are jumping into content for algebra. So we're going to jump right back into math and learning about some algebra. So I did want to start with a couple warm-up questions to get our brains thinking about math again. I know we took a long break over summer, so let's get our minds back into thinking about math and solving equations. So your warm-up problems require you to solve each of the equations for x, the variable x. And this should be a review from pre-algebra. I'm also having you guys do this for warm-up questions because you're going to need to know how to solve for variables in this week's assignments. So we're going to take some time to review what we learned last year, and it will be you will be using these concepts in this week's work. So at this time, I want you to go ahead and click on the pause button, and I do want you to complete the warm-up questions in your math notebook, and for each of the equations you're going to solve for x. So go ahead and take some time, and when you're ready to check your work with mine, go ahead and click play. So click pause so that you can solve those problems in your math notebook. All right, we're going to come back to those warm-up questions and solve those together in just a moment. First, I wanted to tell you what you're doing this week. So we are in week 2, and you will find this week's assignments in the week 2 folder. So to get this to the assignments, you'll click on the materials folder and then go to that week 2 folder. So we are going to be looking at Unit 1, Session 1. We're going to look at formulas and functions. And then Unit 1, Session 2, where we're going to be learning how to solve absolute value functions. And you can see in this, here's an example of an absolute value function where we've got the absolute value of 4x plus 5 equals 21. And within those absolute bars, you can see that there is an equation with the variable x, where you're going to solve that. So that's why we're going to spend some time reviewing solving equations for x. And then we'll take it one step farther and apply it to absolute value functions. So what should you be doing each week? So I just wanted to share a couple tips to get you going and make sure you're establishing good habits as you're working through your work this week. So first of all, you should be making sure you're going through all the lessons in the weekly assignments folder. This is where you're doing all the learning. So you need to be taking the time to go through the slides so that when you come to the graded assignments, you know what to do and do well on those. You should be taking notes as you go through the lessons. Again, just because this is an online class does not mean you don't have a math notebook. You still need to have a math notebook where you're taking notes. Studies have shown that students who actually take notes with their hands retain information and learn a lot better than those who don't. So that's why I require you to take notes in your math notebook. And also in your math notebook, there's plenty of opportunity for practice problems, so those should also be completed in your math notebook. Alrighty, let's go back to those warm-up questions and solve for some variables. So the first equation is 2x equals -8. So what we're trying to figure out here is what number times 2 will equal -8. And we learned how to solve these last year in pre-algebra, and what we learned is that we want to get the x variable all alone on one side of the equation. So we ask ourselves, what is being done to that x variable? It's being multiplied by 2. So we want to do the opposite of what's being done to the variable to solve for the variable. So since x is being multiplied by 2, we want to divide each side by 2. That's right, whatever we do to one side of the equation, we have to do to the other side of the equation. When we have 2 divided by 2, that leaves us with just 1. So I'm just going to put x equals. We don't really need that 1 in front of the x. And then we're going to take -8 divided by 2. A negative divided by a positive is always a negative, so -8 divided by 2 will give us -4. So our answer is -4. We can always go back and check our work, plug the value that we determine x to be, -4, we'll plug that in for x. 2 times -4 equals -8, so we know we did that correctly. Alrighty, our next equation, we've got 2x plus 2 equals 10. Our whole goal is we want to get x all alone on one side of the equation, on the left side. So what we always want to do first is remove the numbers that are, you can think of it as farthest away from the x, or the first step should always be adding or subtracting something to get rid of. So here we've got that +2, so we want to do the opposite. We're going to subtract that 2 to get rid of it. Whatever we do to one side of the equation, we do to the other. That is our first step, is subtracting that 2. So now we're left with just 2x on the left side equals 8. 10 minus 2 is 8. Now we look, what's being done to our variable? It's being multiplied by 2, so to undo that, we're going to divide it. The opposite of multiplying is dividing. So x would equal 8 divided by 2 is 4. So we can always check our work. 2 times x equals 4, so I'll plug that in for x plus 2. So we use order of operations, do our multiplication first. 2 times 4 is 8. 8 plus 2 equals 10. We did it correctly. One last question to go. X minus 7 equals 8. So what is being done to x? It's being subtracted. The 7 is being subtracted from the x, so we want to do the opposite. We're going to add 7 to both sides, and we're going to get our value of x. X equals 15. All right. So you will need to be able to solve for variables and equations just like we did. There is a mini review of doing this in Unit 1, Session 2, so if you need more practice with that, make sure that you're taking advantage of that review in the beginning of Unit 1, Session 2. All right, so absolute value equations. We're going to focus on how to solve absolute value functions in Session 2 now. So let's just review what is an absolute value. So an absolute value is just the absolute value of a number is that number's distance from the 0 on a number line. So what does that mean? So that means it's the distance away from 0 on a number line. So let's look at an example here. So here's our 0. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, -1, -2, 3, -4. We'll stop at -5. So let's look at the absolute value of -3. So the absolute value of a number is that number's distance from 0 on a number line. So let's find -3. So -3 is right here. What is it, the distance between -3 and 0 on the number line? The distance is 1, 2, 3. So the absolute value of -3 would be 3, because it's 3 units away from the 0. You can also think of absolute values, they're going to make a number positive. That's another way of thinking of it. Let's look at one more example. Let's say I ask you what the absolute value of 4 is. Well, what's the distance between 4 and the 0 on the number line? So here's 4. We are 1, 2, 3, 4 units away, so the absolute value of 4 would be 4. So that's what the absolute value means. And now we're going to take it a step further, and we're going to look at how we can solve equations that are in absolute value brackets. So here we've got one. The absolute value of x minus 5 equals 3. Here's an equation that involves absolute value. And how are we going to solve an equation that involves an absolute value? So here's the steps. The first thing we're going to do is we want to isolate the absolute value expression. So what that means is we want to get the equation with the brackets all alone. So in our equation, we already have that here. An example of where it would not be isolated, let's just look at an example. We won't solve it, but just an example. If we had 3 times the absolute value of x minus 1 equals 4, that's an example where the absolute value expression is not isolated because we have this 3 hanging out in front. So the first step is always to get the absolute value expression isolated. So it's all alone. And then what we do is, and we'll look at how to solve when the absolute value expression is not isolated, but for this first example, we're going to start with one where it's already isolated. So then the second step is we want to set the quantity inside the absolute value notation equal to both the positive version and the negative quantity on the other side of the equation. So what does that mean? So that just means we're going to take this equation here and we're going to set the absolute value notation equal to both the positive and negative version. So we would do x minus 5 equals positive 3 and, or I guess I should say, or we could have, whoops, the other version is that we could have x minus 5 equals negative 3. So see what I did there is I just set the equation in the absolute value function. I set that equation equal to positive 3 and I set it equal to negative 3. So I just took whatever the absolute value notation equals and put it to a positive version and a negative version. So I have 2 equations that I'm going to solve for. I have 2 equations that I'm going to solve for. And I actually want to put and in there because those are both going to give us 2 values because our answer can be 2 different values. So I'm going to put and in there. So now I'm just going to solve each equation. So let's look at the one on the left. X plus 5 equals 3. How do I solve for x? I'm going to add 5 to both sides. This is why we did that warm up. And I get x equals 8. So that's one of my possible answers. The other one is going to be when I solve this other equation. So again, I'll add 5 to both sides. But now I've got negative 3 plus 5. And that gives us x equals negative 3 plus 5 is 2. So those are my 2 possible answers. Those are my 2 possible answers. How do I have 2 different answers? Well, remember those absolute value equations, anything in those absolute value bars, when we pull it out, it becomes positive. So that's why we can have 2 different answers. So let's check our work here. Let's do x equals 8. So if I have the absolute value of x minus 5, it should equal 3. X minus 5 equals 3, so we know we did that correctly. The other one is the absolute value of 2 minus 5. And 2 minus 5, what does that give us? Negative 3. When we take the absolute value of negative 3, that is equal to 3 because we know that the absolute value of negative 3 is the distance between 0 and negative 3 on a number line, which is 3. Or you can think of those absolute value bars as anything that's negative will become positive when you take it out. All right, so make sure you take down this example in your math notebook. The important thing is that you know that you're setting up two different equations. You're taking the equation in the absolute value notation and you're setting each of them equal to a positive 3 and then the negative 3, and then solving for both those equations. So that's the steps you'll always take. You're always going to be solving two different equations. I'm going to go on to the next slide, so if you need more time here, go ahead and click pause. All right, here's another example. So now we've got 2 times the absolute value of 4x minus 7 equals 26. So we want to isolate the absolute value expression. The absolute value expression is just that 4x minus 7 that's within the absolute value notation. So we need to remove that 2 that's being multiplied by it. That's our first step, is we need to get that 2 that's hanging out on the outside that's being multiplied by the absolute value notation to go away. So since it's being multiplied, do you think we would get that we would remove that 2 to isolate the absolute value expression? We're going to do the opposite of what's being done. Since 2 is being multiplied, we're going to divide each side by 2. And then we're left with the absolute value of 4x minus 7 equals 26 divided by 2 is 13. So now I've got my absolute value expression isolated. I've done the first step. And now we're just going to do what we did on the previous slide, where we're going to set up 2 equations, where one of them is going to be equal to a positive 13. And then the other one is going to be set equal to a negative 13. So we always take the whatever it's equal to, and we set one equation to a positive 13 and the other to a negative. And then we're just going to solve the equations. So we want to solve for x. I'm going to do the equation on the left side first. So we always start with adding 7 to both sides. We've got 4x equals 13 plus 7 is 20. Our next step is dividing each side by 4. And I'm going to get x equals, I'm running out of space, 20 divided by 4 is 5. And what is our other value of x can that be? So I'm going to start by adding 7 to both sides. Negative 13 plus 7 is what? Negative 13 plus 7 is negative 6. And then we have 4x, right? 4x equals negative 6. Our last step is to divide each side by 4. We're going to be left with a fraction here. And we want to go ahead and reduce that fraction. So it looks like I can divide a 2 out of both sides. So I'm going to have negative 3 out of, I was looking at the bottom there. Divide each side by negative 3. So divide each side by negative 2. By 2. Let's start all over here. We are working on reducing this negative 6/4. So I'm going to divide 2 from each our top and our bottom, our numerator and our denominator, to get the reduced fraction. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. And 4 divided by 2 is 2. So that would give us negative 3/2. So we have both these values are answers. Both these values. If you only solved this equation and said it was just x equals 5, you would be incorrect, because x equals negative 3/2 is also an answer. These are both our answers. So again, what we did was we first isolated the value, our absolute value, the part of the equation that was in the absolute value notation. And then we did that by dividing out that 2, the 2 that was being multiplied. We divided on both sides. Then we just got the plain old absolute value expression. We got that all alone. And then we set up our 2 equations. Set one equal to positive 13 and the other to negative 13. And solved each equation. I'm going to go on to the next slide, so if you need more time to take down notes, go ahead and click pause now. And this is our last problem, and I want you to try this on your own first. And then I'll show you how to do it and you can check your work with mine. But first I want you to solve this on your own. Note that here is your absolute value notation part of the equation. And then we've got minus 4 equals 3. So the equation is the absolute value of 2x minus 3 minus 4 equals 3. So remember, your first step here is that you're going to need to move things around to get the absolute value expression all alone before you set up your two equations. So that's your clue here, is you're going to have to move the part that is not in the absolute value notation. You're going to need to move that to the other side, and then you can set up your two equations. So go ahead and click pause so that you can try this on your own, and then when you're ready to check your work with mine, go ahead and click play. All right, so to get just the 2x minus 3, that absolute value notation part all alone, we're going to add 4 to both sides. We always do the opposite of what's being done. So now I've got the absolute value of 2x minus 3 equals 3 plus 4 is 7. And then I'm going to write my two different equations. First I'll have 2x minus 3 equals positive 7. And then the other version, 2x minus 3 equals negative 3. So again, notice I'm not changing the numbers that are within the absolute value notation. I'm only changing what it's equal to. Whoops, and that should be a negative 7, not a negative 3. And then we're going to solve both those. So I'm going to start by adding 3 to both sides. And then I get 2x equals 10. Divide each side by 2. X equals 10 divided by 2 is 5. X equals 5. And the other part, I'm going to start by doing the same thing, adding 3 to both sides, but now I'm adding 3 to negative 7, and I get negative 4. And then we've got 2x on the left side. 2x equals negative 4. Divide each side by 2. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. So those are my two answers. X equals 5 and x equals negative 2. So go ahead and take notes on this and make any corrections if you needed to. Make sure, okay. And then let's go ahead and call it a day. So that's a wrap. So if you need more time to take notes on this, go ahead and click on pause now. Otherwise, let's complete the key phrase assignment. So you do get 10 points for being a part of this recording, for watching it, taking notes, and trying the practice problems. You get 10 points. But to get your 10 points, you have to complete the key phrase assignment each week. So this week is the week of August 23rd. So you're going to complete the week of August 23rd key phrase assignment. Please make sure when you're doing these weekly key phrase assignments, you're always making sure that the week date in Schoology matches up with the weekly date of the recording you're watching. So how do you complete the key phrase assignment? So first, you're going to log on to your algebra class in Schoology. So if you're not already logged on to algebra in Schoology, do so now. Go ahead and log into algebra. And then once you log on to your algebra class, you're going to click on the materials tab on that left side of the screen. And when you click on materials, you'll see one of your folders is called the weekly recordings and key phrase assignments folder. So then find that folder. So we're going to go to materials, then you're going to go to the weekly recordings and key phrase assignments. Then you're going to scroll down, oops, not the 928, I don't know where that came from. You are actually going to look for the week of 8/23, August 23rd. You're going to look for the week of August 23rd key phrase assignment. And I'm going to put up a question that you guys are going to answer right now. So give me a moment to put up that question. So I have put up an equation. The equation is 2 times the absolute value of x minus 1 equals 8. I want you to explain the first step you would take in solving this equation. You only need to tell me the first step. You don't need to solve it all the way out. I just want you to explain the first step of how we would solve 2 times the absolute value of x minus 1 equals 8. Again, follow the instructions below on how to complete your key phrase assignment. Make sure you click on submit after you've clicked on to the weekly recordings and key phrase assignments folder found in that week of August 23rd key phrase assignment. Click on that, answer the question, click submit, and you are done. You'll get your 10 points. If you have any questions about how to do this, be sure and contact me. Remember, you can find my contact info by clicking on materials, and you'll see that teacher info folder. So have a wonderful rest of your week, and let me know if you have any questions as you're working throughout the week.